Full disclosure off the bat, this video is going to cover some of the most unpractical ground I've ever covered. It's going to touch on things that are technologically impossible at this time, at least as far as we know, we, the general public. And see, I qualify that by saying it's technologically impossible as of this time, but for all we know, it'll always be technologically impossible, and that's that. But in any case, there's zero hands-on usefulness in everything I'm about to discuss. So if you happen to be one of those types who views topics of practical import as the only ones worth discussing, like the only worthwhile topic is a practical topic, if that's you, go away. Shoo. So spare yourself the loss in time. But odds are, if you're already watching my stuff, you're in the polar opposite camp, so you will want to stick around. So a basic question to start things out, how often are disputes over non-empirical matters insoluble in principle? Maybe a better way to ask it is, how often might those disputes be dissolvable in principle? That's probably a better question. All sorts of different answers and spins on that. We can look to Almonds' no disagreement theorem, which you're seeing now, which concludes that when you have two people who are rational in a precise sense and who have common knowledge of each other's blind spots and priors, well, the two of them will find it impossible to agree to disagree in some volitional sense. And not because it would be kind of sort of a cop-out, or like it would feel cop-out-ish, and that's why they don't do it. It's like, no, it would be philosophically distasteful to them to just agree to disagree. Right? They'd be philosophically incapable of it. They'd view it as a conceptually invalid move. Much in the same way that virtually everyone today is incapable of believing that the earth is flat. That belief would be a cop-out, especially when you have two people who are Bayesian rationalists with common priors. So Bayesianism is one way to assess this. But it's not the only way, and it's not what I plan to tackle here anyway, because all of that targets people's incompatible beliefs and ideations about empirical reality, and how to unify or mollify those beliefs about empirical reality. But I don't think Almonds' no disagreement theorem was ever meant to target the types of frankly unempirical and unobservable and unfalsifiable beliefs and ideations that I prefer to think about and certainly to talk about. So that's what I'm going to stick my focus to. Now, rewind the clock to roughly about a century and a half back, and what starts cropping up in the literature is this perspectivism business you're seeing now. It wasn't coined until much later, but it has its roots in the late 19th century. I believe it was coined sometime around mid-20th century. But it started in the 19th century, and it has been applied to beliefs and attitudes about the empirical as well as to the unempirical, to the evaluative, if I may. Stuff that can be verified and stuff that cannot. The idea being that one's perspective muddies beliefs no matter what the domain of inquiry is, and no matter how seemingly verifiable a belief is. So on a strict use of this term, let's call it classical perspectivism. Right? So under classical perspectivism, there's been a lot of stuff, descriptive stuff, that I would not apply to theory to. It was actually originally meant to be a theory of truth. That's how Nietzsche applied it at the end of the day. You can read the Stanford Encyclopedia section on it for details. It's the first thing linked below. But to simplify, and I will simplify, Nietzschean perspectivism was the original epistemic straitjacket. That's why people often refer to Nietzsche as the primordial postmodernist, or the godfather of postmodernism, and maybe even the forerunner to what went on to be known as continental philosophizing. More subjectivity, like stuff like that in a nutshell, if I may be crudely dismissive. And I may, because it's YouTube, and it's a cesspool. But it's still crucial for me to stress that I will not be applying perspectivism to all things knowable. I don't care for it as a position within epistemology. I don't care for it if it's meant to intrude on anything in the way of doxastic logic. And like I said, I don't care for it as a contender for a theory of truth. There's a lot about it that I am happy to dismiss, but it can be useful when it's applied to something else entirely. Right? So here we'll just decouple classical and defanged strands of perspectivism. And I think this must be done because all things empirical and ontological are indeed objectively discoverable and gatherable by human brains. And it's the case across all space and time, not just now. But the problem is that these discoveries we've made and the ones that we'll no doubt continue to make, they hardly exhaust the list of things worthy of discourse and debate. And that leaves the analytic tradition in something of a pickle, which sucks for me because I'm a fan of the analytic tradition. I've always thought that's where the big boys play, but it nonetheless has this long-standing problem. The analytic tradition does, at least for those of us who accept that all emotive and prescriptive utterances undergo this unavoidable filtering process. Whether it's in or out, the prescription will be a polluted one, because the inescapability of a narrowed individual perspective is here for good. But goddammit, I still want to make substantive claims about stuff like ethics. I want to prescribe certain things and proscribe certain other things, and I want to do it in an apologetic way, and I want to do it without being told that I'm just insisting on baseless stuff, insisting on stuff like Coke being superior to Pepsi, and without having all these other analogies to base likes and dislikes being used to cripple my evaluations and my priorities. But at the same time, if I understand full well that defanged perspectivism continues to haunt those unempirical views I hold, well then, I'm just trying to square the circle. Am I not? I mean, if one's own perspective throws a wrench in one's ethics, and if this is inescapable in principle, well then why insist on any ethical theory born of analytic philosophy as opposed to the rival theories peddled by the openly subjective continental tradition? Why? Why be incoherent in this way? That's sort of stuff that bugs me on a day-to-day basis. And that's what I'm going to try to take a stab at answering in this video. It might actually be possible to square this circle at the end of the day. Take a fairly contentious issue that remains controversial precisely because it's unfalsifiable, meaning it's either ethical or evaluative on the face of it. Let's say that two individuals who clash over that issue do not clash over a single verifiable facet of reality. So if there's a fact out there that's been gleaned, these two thinkers will interpret the truthfulness of that fact identically. And the next fact, and the next fact, and so on and so forth, until all the knowable facts have been contemplated and acknowledged. So their fact-based belief sets are identical. And let's also say that their epistemic attitudes on how to arrive at such facts in the first place are also identical. Right? So they have just identical standards from A to Z when it comes to epistemic responsibility. Additionally, let's say that even their understanding of causality is neatly identical. And yeah, causality and determinism do border on metaphysics, so maybe that's more unempirical and metaphysical than some would like to admit. But I felt the need to include that both of these thinkers are determinists. For them, there's no such thing as deserve in any thick sense. They may have some derivative construal of the necessity of desert, just as a motivational scheme, but that's as far as it goes, due to the causality that they believe in. So, full agreement on the facts as well as on the metaphysical implications. So, enter a moral dilemma pinning the interests of a single child being tortured in the fictional city of Omalas, or Omalis. I think it's Omalas. I always forget how it's pronounced. So, interest of that single child who is being tortured in the city versus the interests of everyone else in the same city. Now, in case you've not read this short work of fiction, I suggest you pause right now and get on it. It's in the crotch bar, and it shouldn't take you more than 15-20 minutes tops, unless you're easily distracted or something. It's a good read, though chances are many of you will have already read this, seeing as how I've been sharing it left and right in comment threads for the better part of 2 years now, I think. So hopefully you've paused, and by now you've finished reading the sad tale, meaning you are aware of why the child has to remain in those irredeemably, or at least I would assert, the irredeemably torturous conditions the citizens of Omelas have hitherto kept the child in. Those are the terms, as the author specifies. Like past, present, and future, doesn't matter when, them's the breaks for this poor kid and for this great city, this city of pure eudaimonia. If there was ever a eudaimonic city, it would have to be Omelas. The first few paragraphs go into sufficient detail as to why it's the most magical city, the happiest city, just the most heavenly city in history. And it is set to continue on that path, with the lone price tag consisting of this one kid being kept in these unsanitary, uncompassionate, unthinkable, really, just unthinkably brutal, gruesome conditions. In this dark room where it's just being held captive. And it'll remain captive throughout its life. Not only are the citizens prohibited from releasing the kid, it's much worse than that. If any citizen assists the kid in any way, ever so slightly, or even displays the least bit of compassion while it's in the child's presence, like this alone will qualify as a violation of the terms. As such, the city will fall from grace, and the lives of all those other citizens will no longer be blissful. And so we have our two epistemic agents, and they've both read the story numerous times, and they disagree on the question of whether the existence of Omelas is irredeemable. One of them strongly holds that the child should be freed from the torment ASAP, even if it means the rest of the citizens automatically plummet from blissfulness. And let's call the epistemic agent who believes this, let's call him Arthur Benatar. As for Arthur's epistemic peer, he disagrees, and he does so vehemently. He's quite confident that the price is worth it, because the overall good within this single city is unrivaled by anything else that's ever existed. Now let's call the defender of Omelas' perpetuation. Let's call him Abraham Peterson. So what can Arthur and Abraham point to in order to dissuade each other against their oppositional view, and to then maybe even persuade each other of their own respective view? Are they confined to intuition pumps? Well, that would be a drag. There's got to be something more. Surely if Arthur could just find it in himself to articulate the wisest sequence of moral sentences ever articulated on the subject of sacrificial torture, well, then surely Mr. Peterson would start to budge. Budge a bit, maybe. Not do a full 80 or 180, but just to budge a bit. Well, that's what I think, at least. But then I would think that, wouldn't I? So if I'm going to be fair, I have to acknowledge that it's at least somewhat possible, when you default to being sympathetic with Mr. Peterson's view, to then think that Mr. Peterson might have it in him to articulate one such string of superlatively wise sentences. Sentences that describe the sheer tragedy of what it means to withhold pure bliss from that many people, all for one's sake. It could very well be that the ultimate Steelman argument, that is pro-sacrifice, would succeed in giving Arthur some pause, and not the other way around. Arthur can steelman the opposition to sacrificial torture, and Abraham can steelman the justification of it. And given everyone's interpretive filters, we're not really in a position to know for sure, to know how each string of moral sentences and arguments appears from the other side. Now, full disclosure, it's been a long, long time since I've been the least bit sympathetic to the other side. But there is an other side, and we'd do well to try and absorb it as charitably as we can, without all these interpretive filters. just as the espousers of the other side would do well to soak in an unfiltered version of our arguments. But there's the rub, right? I mean, what I'm essentially calling for is some kind of twisted brain transplant to be performed by mad scientists. This gets into neural interfaces, pioneering brain enhancements, and if any of it ever pans out, it could help us reach that 180 and perhaps wind up back at the 360, or maybe some in-betweenish spot. But it's all speculative, so I kind of sound like a crank by even just referencing it, because it's undoable. Well, or is it? I mean, it's undoable in the here and now, but why the certainty about it being undoable across all space and time? Right? I mean, how is it that perceptual transitivity from person to person is any less possible or any less plausible than standard augmented reality or standard VR? Right? Now, when I sketch out a case like this for people in meat space, and I ask them to read the Omelas story and to tell me if the kid's plight is irredeemable or not, what happens is the more philosophically keen types will just come back and say, well, this perspectivism jargon you're on about is just a synonym for relativism. So even if you get me to agree with you that in this particular case, the sacrificial lamb makes the entire city irredeemable, I can agree with you on that, but it's still just the two of us reaching an intersubjective consensus. Right? It still packs no real punch because it's just relativistic at the end of the day. So that's what they say, more or less. The philosophically disinclined types don't even say that much. They typically just crack jokes about the story or something equally crass like that. So they're useless, all but useless. Whereas the more serious people will provide a clear-cut answer, and it will match my answer most of the time, roughly speaking. But it'll always come with that caveat. The caveat that reminds me how I don't believe there are evaluative facts to be gleaned, and as such I am by default this garden variety relativist. Not some hoity-toity perspectivist or what have you. No, I'm apparently a relativist. And that's false. There is a difference between basic bitch relativism and the sinuous subtleties of perspectivism. Defanged perspectivism. And one difference is, under defanged perspectivism, asserting that evaluative facts don't exist is true in one sense, but it's false in another. Like whereas with relativism or subjectivism, or especially under non-cognitivism in metaethics, it's true in every conceivable sense. It's in the name, non-cognitivism. All ethical propositions are cognitively meaningless. Right? So it's like nothing to see here, folks. It's meaningless. Right? It's not just saying that they are not true. That's one thing to say, that they can't be true in a robust sense. That's perhaps error theory and other strands of anti-realism, like emotivism. But non-cognitivism goes one step further and says that they are meaningless from an intellectual standpoint. Like nothing to see here, folks. And I would say that they're far from meaningless. There is something to see here, because it is possible for each and every one of us to walk a mile in each other's perceptual shoes. And if we had the ability to do that, and if after doing so, some positions seem to make more sense than others as a result of inhabiting the mindset of the other person, well then there is indeed something meaningful here, something worth seeing. So back to the Arthur Benatar-Abraham Peterson clash. If Abraham walks 10,000 miles in Arthur's perspectival shoes, and if Arthur does the same in Abraham's perspectival shoes, and if at the end of this unspoken exchange, a perspectival exchange, right? Not a spoken exchange, an unspoken perceptual one, right? Not another formulaic, oh, I'm going to listen to you speak as you spout off your prepackaged arguments, and then you're going to listen to me speak as I spout my prepackaged rebuttals to those arguments, and so on and so forth. And, we're going to have at it until one arguer is left standing and the other one taps out to the reiteration and to the indignation and to the cheers of the other crowd and to just the sheer logic and the blah, blah, blah. No. None of that bravado horseshit. That filtered approach to solving the problem of the filter itself. That worn-out song and dance will not do. I'm talking about the anti-filter approach. I'm talking about the 10,000-mile marathon, where you're running in someone else's running gear so that they can run the same 10,000-mile marathon in your running gear. And if at the end of it all, Arthur's opposition to the torture of the kid in Omelas is undermined, whereas Abraham's remains firmly intact, that should give you something of a pause. Right? Now, it shouldn't make you go, well, I guess Omelas is redeemable after all, well, because it's just two people, right? It's a non-representative sample. But imagine if we could come up with a representative sample. Now, imagine if we didn't just do it with the two of them, or not even just with you and all the people you've clashed with the most throughout your life so far, right? And not even when it comes to all the citizens in Omelas, right? Including the sacrificial lamb. I'm saying we can go beyond that. Imagine if we can do this anti-filter perspectival amalgamation with the 7 billion people on Earth today. Right? You get to inhabit over 7 billion mindsets. You go for that hypothetical 10,000-mile marathon 7 billion separate times. You don't just swap lens with a few locals you have a habit of butting heads with. No, you do it with everyone who is capable of forming opinions on whether something can be redeemed or not. Something like, let's say, the history of sentient life. Now, perhaps we can take it a step further and include the opinions of all those who are long deceased. And I know what you're thinking, and I say, no, this would not amount to letting ignorance reign supreme, because just as how you would be able to weigh 13th century dogmas against modernism, they would, by perceptually inhabiting your space, end up doing the exact same thing, and would no doubt come to see that one view is more bankable than the other. Right? The modernist view is more bankable than the 13th century view, or whatever century comes before it. And that would arguably disabuse them of those original dogmas. So whether this perceptual free-for-all shift encompasses 7 billion humans who are alive in the here and now, or whether it encompasses every human being who has ever lived and been capable of forming thoughts and opinions to one degree or another, it doesn't matter. All that matters is we finally start to internalize debates as less a matter of you versus me, and more a matter of perspective A versus perspective B. And this would go a long way in getting everyone's reactive defenses down. And I will say this much, let's assume that for some reason my brain cannot undergo this procedure, but plenty of other brains can. If you defilter my favorite authors and thinkers and merge their perspectival dispositions with the perspectival dispositions of my least favorite authors and thinkers, and if this causes my favorites to start to sound more and more like my least favorites, and if my least favorites have the same done to them, but they don't start sounding anything like my favorites, well, I will take that seriously. And this is really how you separate the dogmatists from the fallibilists. To be a dogmatist is to not take something like that seriously, because you think yourself infallible, or epistemically special in some way. So even if the people who always made you nod along to what they were saying, right, if they started to sing the polar opposite tune because they finally got to perceive that tune in unfiltered ways, and if you think that's their failing, even though you know that they've also inhabited your mindset every bit as much as they've inhabited the mindsets of their mortal enemies, or at least what used to be their mortal enemies, right? If they've done that and you still believe that they have no reason to budge, right? And if they only thought about it the way you're thinking about it right now, they'd realize it. Like, if that's where you come down on, at that point, you're just waving the dogma flag, right? So if the lone victim in Omelas undergoes this procedure and comes to view the city as a perfectly redeemable one, well, then I would too. Because in that case, the kid is truly the lone victim. Now, things do get complex when you have multiple victims, or in case of the real world we live in, innumerable victims. Though I should stress that even in the case of Almonds, I technically don't believe that the kid would reach any such verdict about the city being redeemable. And I believe that everyone else in the city would budge if they perceived an unfiltered version of what the kid perceives, or even what the majority of the readers perceive when they read the story for the first time, or even with subsequent readings. So yeah, spouting arguments at people who conclude something else and who don't know what it's like to be inside your headspace, like that's not how all of this works. Like that's how the average internet comment section work, and we see where that's gotten the internet. And realizing that that's not how it works, that has to be the takeaway when it comes to all of these unempirical debates. Right? The crux of those debates is, do not try to make pseudo-propositional claims about ethical facts existing out there in the ether. Facts that can be discovered. The moment you do that, it invites what I've dubbed the Fairweather logical positivism effect. Right? You get these people who aren't logical positivists, who don't argue like logical positivists, but who are happy to wear the costume of a logical positivist on this particular topic, or somewhat related topics that touch on sacrificial torture and collateral damage in general. Right? It's just this blatant Fairweather logical positivism because it's convenient. Right? If it's someone on the internet and let's say they're browsing some stupid Facebook feed or something and they come across someone who expects to be congratulated for throwing caution to the wind and starting a family and announcing it. Like, can you even imagine pushback in the form of the pushback that you typically get when you make some risk-averse argument, right? Can you imagine stumbling upon a Facebook feed like that and seeing someone give pushback in the form of, well, can you show me some empirical evidence that what you're doing here warrants a congratulations? No, it's unimaginable because double standards permeate these debates. Debates about whether people should withhold ostensive benefits, alleged benefits, to some non-existent persons so as to prevent collateral damage to other non-existent persons. Right? Whether they should do that or whether they should tolerate all sorts of collateral damage so as to secure those ostensive benefits. Typically a newcomer who likes to play the role of philosophical plaintiff, right? They'll put on a logical positivism front when dealing with the position that tolerates zero or minimal collateral damage. And this move is supposed to make whoever the opponent might be the defendant, right? So if you oppose collateral damage, you are the defendant by default, which is just too cute, right? Because they will not apply the least bit of scrutiny to the status quo, which assumes that withholding goods is worse than preventing bads, right? Because the novice is almost always deluded enough to actually think that the conventional view is some null hypothesis that doesn't need to be defended in the first place. And it is only the preventionist who makes strong claims for himself, right? So if you think Omelas should continue undisturbed, well, you're the plaintiff, right? Whereas if you do object to Omelas, you're the defendant because you're making some call for change. And that's plain false. It's a push-pull relationship. There is no null hypothesis, not on this subject, not on any subject that's adjacent to this one. So to stop the would-be plaintiff in his tracks, just accept that this is not some clean-cut truth versus falsity debate, nor is it a me versus you debate. Right? It's a dispute involving two or more perspectives that happen to have manifested in these separate brains, right? Which is incidental. It's every bit as incidental as is the fact that I was born as myself and not as someone else. To hold that there is something profound in me being myself or in you being yourself is to essentialize the incidental. Never mistake the incidental for the essential. And once that's out of the way, it becomes so easy to accept the possibility that once the other 7 billion perspectives make their way through my cognitive software, well, there is a chance that I might budge on foundational questions pertaining to collateral damage of this, that, or the other. Things of that sort. Things that supervene on this topic. Right? But I will never budge by listening to the would-be plaintiff utter sentences which they find convincing. Like, just as I know they won't budge by listening to me utter sentences, which I find convincing. Because of course I do. Because those sentences aim to represent ideations in my brain, which are ineffable. When we engage in this argumentation construction crap, it's performative. We're trying to articulate the ineffable. It's doomed on arrival. You will not grasp the ineffable bits from the articulated bits. You will just hear words. Their ideations are their own, and they're not reducible to mere words. And granted, language is the best we have, but language is not good enough. I mean, evidently, it's nowhere near good enough. Like I said, take a peek at the average internet comment section. That's where language gets you. That plus ego. So people pack a lot of egos, and they use language which does not represent the ideation, and it's a recipe for disaster, like dialectic sewage. And you can apply this to any other issue. Take the most painfully over-discussed issue of our time. And not just our time. And this is the most over-discussed issue in the history of the internet, it seems. Right? Take the 2016 election. This is just the quintessential case of language failure at the operational level. So much so that even if we were capable of running the perspectival transitivity experiment, like where every Trump supporter and every Clinton supporter got to perceive every last ideation from every last person involved in the whole ordeal, I would find it genuinely difficult to tell you what the amalgamated, accumulated perspective, the panoramic perspective, would end up believing as it pertains to that election, and who should have won. Right? There's just too much personality and identity of the respective voting blocks that's baked into the issues themselves. So even if you ended up with a superorganism who took everything that everyone believed, fuck if I know what that superorganism's ultimate verdict would be. But there would be an ultimate verdict. It's just damn near impossible to tell what happens when the identity factor is dissolved and all that remains are the respective policy prescriptions of the two camps. And perhaps the varying corruption and incompetence levels of the two candidates themselves. Sometimes it's damn near impossible to tell what the panoramic superorganism, let's say the epistemic meta-character, what view it will land on when all those myopic and narrow and even broad views are shifted around every which way and then added up one way. So I guess the takeaway from all this is that while perspectivism comes up short in its original aim, which was to be a theory of truth, and it fails spectacularly at that. It's just fantastic failure when it comes to that. But be that as it may, it does offer up a sound methodology for moral and axiological reconciliation, as outlined with the superorganism, who does see all and does perceive all. And I can see how this methodology would not seem compelling if you still believe in the existence of moral facts, or if you cling to the idea that moral sentences are propositional in some way. Because then, for you, it could always be the case that even if a panoramic perspectivism was around with its conjoined set of ideations, and if it came up with some type of reconciliation, like all those merged perspectives could still easily miss out on some yet undiscovered feature of moral reality. Now, I'm happy to admit that that might be what's in store, but as time passes, I do find myself leaning increasingly closer to skepticism in metaethics, such that I don't believe we're arguing over any substantive truths and falsities when we start to explore what underlies moral disagreement. I think the Azad Gap withstands all attacks from metaethical realists and other critics, such that moral discourse unavoidably collapses into us doing the boo hurrah thing, essentially. It's just the same old thing that humanity's been doing since from the get-go. And that's ultimately why I take the possibility of a truly panoramic perspectivism to be the closest thing we have to ethical and axiological resolve. We're just not going to get there by reiterating our respective little spiels about what's permissible and what's impermissible. That's a epistemic dead end. All you can hope for is that your attitudes and ideations will come out on top in the aftermath of the Perspectival transferability project. And you shouldn't even hope for that, because that's an egoistic hope. Right? That's your very own take, right? The idea that it should go on to be the take. Because if it's not, well, what's the problem? All that's happened is you've been perceptually enhanced. Right? If you experience firsthand, from the first-person perspective, all the ideations that your enemies have always championed, and if you're actually compelled by them more than they're compelled by your particular belief set, once they actually perceive it on the first-person level, well, then all the better for you. You will have made progress and learned something. Something that you can't learn by listening, but only by experiencing. But naturally, I do hold steadfast in my conjecture that if we do one day manage to run the transfer across all agents who developed some type of non-factual belief, I'm not going to pretend that I think my non-factual belief set will lose out to their non-factual belief sets. I think they'll be more impressed by what they were missing due to not being in my head. They'll be far more impressed than what I finally get to discover when I realize what I had been missing out by not knowing what it's like to be inside their heads, individually or collectively. But like I said earlier, I would think that, now wouldn't I? So yes, classical perspectivism, as formulated by Nietzsche, did operate as a theory of truth, and that's why it fails. It fails because it made it its business to compete with and to try and discredit other theories of truth, objective theories of truth, like truth that supervenes on reality. I guess we can say classical perspectivism was reality canceling. Right? So there was no actual reality, there was only filtered reality under its view. Like the classical perspectivist is telling all other epistemologists who subscribe to a different theory of truth, like the correspondence theory of truth, as a basic example to use, like the classical perspectivist on the one hand tries to assert that this theory is objectively false, but on the other hand waives the right to say that any given thing can be objectively true or false in the first place, like non-perspectivally true or false. So it's just question begging. Like if Nietzsche's own perspective barricaded him from making legit claims on unfiltered reality, then whatever critiques he might have of the correspondence theory of truth pack no punch, or they pack comparatively little punch, because his rival theory is self-undermining, where if the correspondence theory is sound and valid, it packs a mighty big punch. You can't KO any robust theory of truth with a rival theory that's dead on arrival, right? Because it just ends up getting caught in an endless cycle of self-referential quicksand. You have to allow for an unfiltered starting point. And much of continental philosophizing doesn't even allow for that, because reality itself is a filter. It's a fog, I guess we can say. Whereas the analytic tradition generally holds that reality itself is wholeheartedly unfiltered, and that we have access to it. And continental philosophers still scoff at this, as if it were some bold move. And again, it's an understandable move when it comes to non-factual beliefs, which we will always have. Right? The human brain evolved to make normative judgments. Right? There are things worthy of believing which have no factual origin whatsoever. And what is more, your enemies, right? Your most enthusiastic enemies will not stop talking as if their moral utterances are factually true. Especially your, main enemies who have the biggest megaphones. So I'm not even suggesting that you should not talk as if. I'm not saying you should stop talking as if there's some moral truth to discover here. But all of that gets into moral quasi-realism and fictionalism and all these associated game theoretical implications for fighting propaganda with propaganda. And that's a separate video, I guess. The main point is a failed theory of truth can make for a winning methodology when it comes to moral fence mending. And if that's not the case, if you think there's an argument against that, let me hear it. And if it's the same old attempt to argue for meta-ethical realism that's robust, yeah, we're going to have a problem.